Hi, it's Dwyer. It's September 14th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, my site's a niche site. So when I make a video and I go to sleep and I wake up and I see that that video has more than 2,000 views, that's big news for me, right? I'm not one of these sites here online that gets tens of thousands of views, right? My crowd really is a niche crowd. So let me thank everyone for that. You know where I stand on the fight. I understand many of you, perhaps most of you, disagree with me. Let me point out too, I did do some reading, just trying to understand, just trying to understand other points of view. Before I go further too, let me say my prayers are with the Ricky Hatton family. Nod to Ricky. Let me just say, Duke McKenzie, a British boxing pundit, is someone I listen to from time to time, and I was really struck by his comments on the fight. He feels that if anyone got robbed, it was Crawford, that Crawford deserved a much wider margin. Understand, too, I looked at the Athletic. The Athletic's interesting. They had 3 guys watching the fight and scoring the fight live. Right? 3. By the way, all of them gave Canelo the first round. Just food for thought. But the 3 guys had wider cards. At least 2 of the 3 guys had wider cards than the 115, 113. Right? So I recognize that we all saw different fights. Right? That there's a group out there that feels that Bud ran away with it. Right? For the record, let me just say, I believe we all feel that the 5th round was a Canelo round, right? I think we realized that the scoring on the live telecast was a bit different, giving Crawford the first 4 rounds. I don't know the metric anyone's using on that, right? In the comment section, if you want to tell us which of the 4 rounds you thought Crawford landed the more meaningful shots, please feel free. I think we all agree, and this is the key here for this fight, right? I think we all agree that the 11th and 12th rounds are Crawford rounds, and that Crawford ends the fight with an exclamation point. In the 12th round, he catches Canelo out of position, and Canelo is discombobulated, right? He's not dropped or anything like that, but he is outmaneuvered. He's caught naked. Crawford hits him flush in the face, right? Crawford not loading up on shots, but landing shots, has Canelo out of sorts in a way that we really haven't seen Canelo out of sorts. Let me say this too, and this is with my scoring, right? I thought the 6th and 7th rounds were interesting. I thought they're Crawford rounds. I thought Crawford by then gets out of his shell a bit, starts taking chances, and starts trading with Canelo. Now let me say, it's breathtaking when you see a guy whose last fight was at 154 in against an undisputed champion at 168, and he's actually opening up a bit, right? Understand, I gave Crawford the 6th and 7th rounds, right? So Crawford definitely had some eye-opening moments where he's taking chances and where he's outboxing Canelo, right? No question about that. I just don't know how that offsets the shots to the body, the fact that it's Canelo on his front foot backing up Crawford. It's Crawford up against the ropes at times. Uh, and nobody gets hurt, nobody gets knocked down. I just don't know how you pull 4 belts off of what happened in those rounds. Well, let's talk about the future. You know where I stand. That video's here online. I normally don't pull videos that, have audio and stuff like that. That video is going to stay online. Those were my thoughts right after the fight. I stand by them. Right? That was my impression. Had I scored the fight, had I been a judge, my scorecard would have read 7-5 Canelo. Right? Certainly, I thought Canelo did enough to defend his title. Well, let's talk about the future for both fighters. It is what it is. I accept the decision, right? Crawford is the champion at 168. Where does that leave us? Now, it's one of my favorite athletes in history, right? For some reason, no one loves this guy. For some reason, he's not even in the conversation these days as being the best ever, when he was clearly considered to be exactly that in the 80s and 90s. But Wilt Chamberlain, right, when he was retired and people look back at his career, but it was Wilt Chamberlain who famously said, "No one roots for Goliath." Right? Now let me just say, Canelo, at this stage, is all dressed up with nowhere to go. Right? This is a great fighter. Like Crawford, Canelo is one of the best I've seen. Right? And, understand, the most compelling evidence that the public dynamic was against him, felt that he was losing the fight, was the live line. I myself had a casino app open, was looking at the live line, and it tilted toward Crawford even before the 11th round, before Crawford's strong finish. Right? I concede that. I don't know what those gamblers were thinking, but it's okay. Right? So let me just say this. Canelo, even from my seat, where I thought Canelo wins the fight outright, Canelo can't have a rematch with Crawford because of the fight flow. Right? Because Crawford's best rounds are rounds 11 and 12. Right? Crawford starts slow. Right? Frankly, Crawford looked like a guy 1 fight removed from 147 early. Right? He starts slow. You were wondering for several rounds in this fight whether Crawford could even hurt Canelo. Right? Crawford finishes strong. Crawford's landing flush shots at the end of the fight. If I'm Canelo, I think to myself, wow, you know what? The best parts of this fight for me were the early rounds. Do I want to have a rematch with this guy? Only to have him prove to the public that the first fight was not a fluke. Didn't you have that on this card with the Brandon Adams Boachuk fight? Right? We all went into that fight thinking, wow, Adams was some lucky son of a gun that first fight, getting that stoppage in a fight where he was getting spanked. Right? This fight, after this fight, what can you say if you're from the Boachuk side of the ledger? Right? Wow, well, our guy lost the second fight. Adams is up 2-0. Right? The thing with Canelo is he's better off never facing Crawford again. Right? Because he won't come in with the benefit of the doubt that he came in with as the undisputed champion. right? This is kind of like Tyson Fury, Usyk, right? The first fight, the feeling is, well, Usyk's going to have to show us that he has done enough to take Fury's title, right? That's the view. I don't care if Usyk had a title himself or what. Look, that's the view, right? You're fighting the champ. The champ is the other guy. Well, once you get that benefit of the doubt, because that comes with the belt, well, in the second fight, you're going to score it differently. The close rounds, you're going to say, well, now it's Usyk who won the first fight. So if it's a close round where no one has a clear edge, that's not going to move the challenger closer to the win. Right? So the first fight, photo finish, even with the 9th round. Right? The first fight, split decision. The second fight, unanimous. Right? Well, understand, if I'm Canelo, I just lost a unanimous decision to Terence Crawford in a fight where the older man finished stronger than I did. The older man who many people are going to say, hey, we feel that Crawford won the first fight 9-3. Right? The older guy who has the narrative of, wow, was he brave? One fight removed from 147, taking on the undisputed champion at 168. And he won that fight. Folks, that narrative's going to carry Crawford. So if I'm Canelo, that door's not open to me. Right? I'm better off with this fight where, granted, public consensus is that Canelo lost the fight. I understand that. Just like public consensus is that Josh Allen deserved the MVP in the NFL last year over Lamar Jackson. Right? Years from now, folks will look back and they'll say, well, wow, how did that really work? How could they think that? Right? I believe years from now, people are going to look back at the first half of this fight. And they're going to think to themselves, wow, what exactly is Crawford doing to warrant him winning every round on Skipper's card for the first 4 rounds? Right? Even the first round that all 3 guys at the Athletic gave to Canelo. Right? Later generations can judge for themselves. I believe Canelo is better off with just this fight than having a second fight against Crawford. Right? As you get older, you start to realize that the money you accepted for some of your deals was the most expensive money that you ever received. Right? Even if it was a decent amount of money, you start to look back and you say, wow, by taking that project, it foreclosed me working on this other project with people who were great to work with. Right? Didn't I pay too high a cost? Well, let me just say, a Crawford rematch would be expensive for Canelo. He would have to really batter Crawford to be awarded the decision. This narrative, and it's gotten out of hand, of Crawford somehow being much, much, much better a boxer than Saul Alvarez, it's going to be hard to rebut. So as I see it, Canelo really doesn't have a Crawford rematch option. It's better for him, it's more lucrative for him to continue on the road he's on, where he just acknowledges that, Crawford gave him a great match. He can live with the decision, even though it was against him. It's just better for him to move on with his life than to have the rematch and then lose the rematch and validate what people believe today. Let me say, too, that it's also too expensive, and I mean this, for Canelo to continue his career. We understand Canelo's a cash cow. This fight was a bonanza. By the time the main event happened, every seat was taken. Right? They had a great gate here. I'm sure the Netflix numbers are going to be bonzo. Right? So Canelo, his next fight, he would get tens of millions of dollars. But you understand that if he loses that next fight, it's over. In other words, for a guy who's gotten all the money Canelo has gotten, fighting for 10 or 20 million dollars against some opponent who isn't A-list, right? Doesn't have a title, doesn't have a huge fan base, would be too much of a step down, right? Canelo fighting against Lester Martinez, and that'd be a good fight. Martinez is the guy who sparred heavily with another Bomac client, Terrence Crawford, in preparing Crawford for his fight. Martinez is the guy who got the draw against top-rated Christian and Billy. Just understand, Canelo can't fight a guy like Martinez because, number one, Martinez is dangerous. Number two, no one knows him. Number three, Martinez doesn't have a belt to give Canelo. Should Canelo win that fight? Understand, 168 is dangerous. We haven't talked about it enough. Right? You have Hamza Shiraz. Folks, Shiraz is major competition for Canelo. Understand, Shiraz hits harder than Terrence Crawford. Shiraz has height and reach with a jab. Shiraz, of course, and I know 60% of the United Kingdom seems to feel that Carlos Adames beat him. Shiraz, as I make this video, is actually unbeaten. That Carlos Adames fight was ruled a draw. Right? And Canelo doesn't have the foot speed today that Adames has. Right? Diego Pacheco. These are names that you need to consider. Big time length, excellent jab. Right? Canelo might not be able to get close to Pacheco for several rounds. Understand the sparring too. Pacheco is part of the Benavidez boxing family. Right? Pacheco's close to David Benavidez. Pacheco works with Benavidez' father. Right? It would be a group effort to, prepare Pacheco for that fight. You and I know who Pacheco is. The public doesn't. Right? Canelo would be the headliner in that fight. Canelo's already in his mid-30s. I hear Canelo's a great golfer. Right? If I'm Canelo, I'm thinking, gee, why do I want to be in the ring with guys like Shiraz, Pacheco, Martinez, and Billy? Right? And Billy, limited, but an athlete. Right? And Billy's going to be coming in the pocket every 30 seconds, throwing big shots. Right? This is the young guy who is headstrong. There's a moment during the telecast where Andre Ward says that he would talk to Martinez about strategy. When he's asked on the telecast whether he would talk to Billy about strategy, Ward said he wouldn't because he wouldn't expect Billy to listen to him. Right? You're talking about a headstrong, athletic guy who, even if he can't match you in boxing skills, is very physical with a punch, who remains unbeaten himself. Right? Who's from the, Canadian Arthur Beterbiev family. Right? And so just understand, if I'm Canelo, now that I'm out of the main spotlight, right? Crawford has all of the belts at 168. Is it worth my time, given that I'm already fabulously wealthy, given that I'm one of the most recognizable people in the entire sport, right? You saw at this fight, they showed dignitaries, and they showed Julio Cesar Chavez, who hasn't fought in decades, and the crowd cheered him, right? Cheered him. Because, of course, he has that profile. The crowd recognizes that he's a great. If I'm Canelo, I have that today. I don't need another fight to be someone in an arena 20 years from now, 25 years from now, getting cheered just for being in attendance. Right? So, let me just say, why fight a Pacheco? What title is he going to give you? Why fight a Shiraz? What title is he going to give you? Why fight an Billy? Why fight a Martinez in a fight that doesn't involve a title? And why fight a Crawford who, let's face it, is most dangerous when he figures you out? In other words, you know, the Crawford of the 6th round, the Crawford of the 7th round, I mean, understand, even I think that if you break this 12-round fight in two, Crawford wins the second half of the fight. More importantly, that 12th round, look at how spun around Canelo is. Look at his feet relative to Crawford. Look at the punches he couldn't throw. Look at how defenseless he is when Crawford hits him in the face. Right? The next fight would start where this fight left off. Right? I do feel Canelo won the first fight. I believe Crawford would have the upper hand in the second fight. This fight, there was a big question, huge, on whether Crawford could take Canelo's power. Now, there's a pre-fight interview out there. I did my due diligence like everyone else, where Bomac says, look, once we get past the 7th round, Canelo won't be able to knock out Crawford. Right? That was a Bomac quote. Well, you know what? We made it past the 7th round. Now Crawford knows the angles. Right? And you get the feeling, just like Crawford couldn't knock out Canelo, I hope anyone thinking about the Crawford side of the play took Crawford by decision. Right? A knockout was not going to happen. Well, now there's the feeling that Canelo, who couldn't keep Crawford stationary to throw the left hook at Crawford's head, even as he was landing it on Crawford's side, right? Canelo might not be able to stop Crawford if this fight makes it past the first 4 or 5 rounds, right? So Canelo can't fight the champ at 168. What's the point of fighting the other guys? If Crawford vacates at 168, isn't there the feeling that, Canelo would be picking up a belt Crawford voluntarily left behind? And understand, it's not like Canelo would be fighting stiffs. Skull's already gone the distance with Canelo at 168. And, boxing's a young man's game. There are young men who are armed and dangerous. Right? You saw Berlanga hit the canvas during the Shiraz fight. And you saw Shiraz just, decide he was going to completely close the show. Drops Berlanga a second time. Right? That's the level of power we're dealing with. If I'm Canelo, why do I want to pass the torch to a new generation? How does that help my legacy? when I can get millions of dollars, not only in the stock market, right? If Canelo were to just throw his wealth in gold, he would be financially set for life. But he can get millions of dollars as an endorser, as an entrepreneur. What happens when you're high profile like this is entrepreneurs come to you so they could use your brand. So Michael Jordan, who wasn't a restaurateur, had a big time restaurant in Chicago during the 1980s. You could imagine, if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm Alex Rodriguez, who is a very successful entrepreneur with a string of businesses, in Mexico and elsewhere. If I'm Alex Rodriguez, I might say, hey, Canelo, I'm interested in opening up this string of businesses in Mexico. I'd like for you to be part of the project, right? Because Canelo is known. Canelo's brand carries a certain sway. Canelo has that today. What's the point of hopping in the ring with Diego Pacheco, Hamza Shiraz, Lester Martinez, in your 30s, getting hit with big shots? For what exactly? To get a belt that Crawford has left behind? To have a non-title fight? To have a sanctioning body eliminator fight? Let me point out, too, that if Crawford, and I know Crawford's talking about 160, folks, that's dangerous. You heard me mention Carlos Adames, right? You're talking about an athlete who's going to come find you. Understand, I privately think the best at 160 is Janabek, who's a southpaw. Right? He's a southpaw. He wouldn't have the righty-lefty issues that Canelo was having. Right? And Janabek almost certainly would think that he hits harder than Crawford. I know the public thinks, oh, Crawford just beat Canelo at 168. I'm telling you, there's a slew of guys out there who are privately thinking to themselves, that was an opponent-specific match. I'm not sure this guy can hang it, you name it. 160. Let's go deeper. 154. Right? Okay, sure. He beat Madrimov. Just like Virgil Ortiz did. You don't think Ortiz wants this fight? Crawford against the towering Inferno, Sebastian Fundora. Are you sure about that fight? Folks, I know Canelo, who, is a technician, but isn't a great athlete. Can I say that in public? Right? Isn't a great athlete. I know Canelo is on record saying Crawford is much better than Floyd Mayweather. Right? Understand, Mayweather has something that Crawford and Canelo don't have. Right? Mayweather's an athlete. Revisit Mayweather Canelo. You'll see, first round, and this is an older Mayweather. Mayweather's right in front of Canelo. And Mayweather bends down and hits Canelo in the stomach a few times with shots. And you understood. Right? Mayweather, if these two guys did a decathlon, Mayweather would win the decathlon over Canelo. Xander Zejas at 154. Folks, he's a Mayweather level athlete. I'm not saying he's a Mayweather level boxer. Although that might happen eventually, right? This is the young guy who's figuring things out. This is the guy who is taking the driving test for the first time, right? Doesn't quite know the road like the cab driver who's had a license for 10 years. But let me just say this, right? If Crawford picks the wrong opponent at 154, Crawford might look like a guy who's 37, 38 years old. Right? Just think it through. Right? He fought Madrimov Folks, he hasn't fought, you know, Zejas. He hasn't fought Ortiz. Right? Sebastian Fundora and Keith Thurman, that's a fascinating fight that's coming up. Right? But understand, they're Fundora fights where an opponent's looking up at him, wondering what is going on for the first 3 or 4 rounds. So if I'm Crawford, while I think if Crawford sticks around 168, he could beat Christian and Billy, who I think's limited, who I think doesn't move that well, who I think moves in straight lines, who I think has no back foot. Right? While I think Crawford could beat Billy, Crawford would never fight Lester Martinez because they know each other. Right? That would be like Joe Frazier fighting Kenny Norton, which he never did. Right? What's the point of that? Crawford's at the stage of his career where Roy Jones was when Jones won the heavyweight championship. If Crawford walks away now, he's going to be considered one of the best ever. Right? Also, the narrative fits. Who was Crawford's last opponent? The undisputed champion at 168 pounds. Right? If Crawford decides he's going to show the world that he belongs in the ring with Diego Pacheco or Hamza Shiraz, folks, that's high risk. Both of those guys have punches. Right? Crawford against Canelo could move on his back foot, knowing that Canelo had to come find him. 2 fighters roughly the same height, right? I'm not saying they're the same size, but roughly the same height and stuff like that. Against an opponent who's taller with a much longer reach, that might not be the best strategy. Right? I'm moving back. The other guy doesn't have to come find me. He can just hit me with his jab from distance. In other words, I have to actually come forward. I have to get inside the guy's jab. Otherwise, I'm going to get battered with the jab, and some judges are, going to look at the fight, and they might disregard the fact that I'm the reigning champion, as apparently these guys did. Right? So, Crawford might not want to fight tall, lanky, long power, ring coverage. Right? Pacheco? No. Shiraz? No. Right? Let me also say, too, I know people are interested in Canelo, David Benavidez. What's the point of that fight now? Right? If I'm Canelo, I realize, okay, Benavidez is going to want a fight where punches are landed. Right? He's going to want that fight. That fight could end badly. Right? Benavidez, by the way, unbeaten as I make this video. 2-division champ himself. He was the champion at super middleweight. Right? Now he's the champion at light heavy. His next fight is against Anthony Yard. I get the feeling he's going to parlay that into taking on opponents in the UK, taking on, possibly Beterbiev later, possibly Bivol later. Folks, you have a series of great fights that are possible at 175. Now, sure, Canelo's a cash cow in a way nobody else is in the sport outside of the heavyweight division. Right? So, and Benavidez understands, okay, a lot of people want me to fight Canelo. Right? But is Benavidez, a champion at 175, going to weight drain himself now that he's in, his late 20s, early 30s? Is he going to weight drain himself to fight Canelo at 168? Is that a fight you want? If Benavidez says, no, player, come fight for my belt at 175. Right? Does Canelo, after this fight, want to deal with the guy who's not moving away from him like Bud was? Right? Who's not there, to outbox him, but who's actually there, and don't kid yourself, Benavidez is cerebral. Benavidez is highly technical. I guarantee you, Benavidez will be prepared for Canelo's left hook. That doesn't mean Canelo can't win the fight, right? But he's going to have to go to plan B against Benavidez because that's what Benavidez does. Now, if I'm Canelo and I already have emeritus status, if I retire today, 25 years from now, I can be at a fight and get cheered like Julio Cesar Chavez. Right? The thing with losing to Terence Crawford is that we all knew Crawford was a great fighter coming into the fight. Right? Crawford, of course, undisputed in two different weight classes, 140 and 147. Right? So Canelo's last fight was a fight against Terence Crawford. People will forgive him for the loss. Not only that, they'll go one step further. And they'll say, you know what, Canelo, who in the moment we know wants no part of Benavidez, people will say, Canelo really fought everyone. Right? Canelo's last fight was not against the 147, 154 guy, right? A guy one fight removed from 147. But they'll say, oh, he fought the great Crawford. Right? So, folks, you add this up. And I believe politically, the best outcome, and both of these guys have been great for the sport, is for both guys to retire. Right? Crawford's at that Roy Jones moment. Had Roy Jones retired after winning the heavyweight championship, right? Had there been no, Antonio Tarver loss, Glenn Johnson loss, Denis Lebedev loss, Joe Calzaghe loss, right, folks? Jones's star would have shined more brightly without all that punishment. Right? Bernard Hopkins' rematch loss. Right? You'd just have a great record, and you'd have a guy who, you would say, wow, that's right. Roy Jones did fight for the heavyweight title. Right here, Terence Crawford, folks, right now we're viewing him as a 154 guy who beat the king at 168. If he sticks around 168, if he fights Christian Mbili, right, and Mbili is a better athlete than Terence Crawford, right, quicker twitch. I'm not saying he's a better boxer. Certainly not saying that, right? Crawford is Mr. Complicated, right? Crawford was just lefty against Canelo, as he had to be. Against Mbili, you'd see Crawford as a righty, you'd see Crawford crouching, you'd see Crawford, doing a bunch of other Terence Crawford things. But what's the point in fighting Christian Mbili? Let me say this too, and I don't say it lightly. At heavyweight, I know Usyk is big man on campus, right? They can split up his belts. They can, say to other fighters, you get a belt, you get a belt, you get a belt. The fans know who the heavyweight champion is, right? Moses Utama, if he goes out and wins a belt, we're still going to feel that he's not really the champion until he fights Alexander Usyk. Now, if I'm Usyk, and Usyk, of course, said, hey, I need more time, I have an injury, and then, of course, they caught him at a club, dancing. He doesn't want to fight Joe Parker. If I'm Usyk, do I fight Joe Parker? Right now, 20 years from now, if Usyk's at a boxing event and they say, here's Alexander Usyk, who retired unbeaten, isn't he going to be treated like Julio Cesar Chavez was treated? Right, folks? Joe Parker's dangerous. Ajit Kabayel is the premier body puncher at heavyweight. What punch do we have questions about Usyk taking? Isn't it body shots? If I'm Usyk, haven't I already done a ongoing siege of the UK? Haven't I beaten some of the UK's beloved fighters? Right, folks, in the UK, we're coming out of a heavyweight division era that featured, in terms of UK fighters, Fury and Joshua. Right? You're telling me that one guy beat both guys twice each? Right, folks? Doesn't there come a time where the risk reward doesn't add up even for great fighters? Right? I'm just saying, look at the age gap between Itama, early 20s, Usyk, what is he, 38 years old? Sooner or later, you have to walk away from the sport of boxing. Right? To quote the Smiths, UK band, if I'm Usyk, I ask the question, how soon is now? Right, folks? You know, the biggest moments of Usyk's career were beating Joshua and Fury, right? I mean, and for good measure, Dubois, right? Think about how much he conquered the UK. Right? In the history books, you're going to say, wow, this was really a British era for heavyweight boxing. Oh, and by the way, a non-Brit beat the British fighters. Right? So if I'm Usyk, why am I not thinking retirement? He doesn't strike me as a guy running the streets spending a lot of money. He strikes me as a family guy. You know, Alexander, I think your kid can afford college right now. Right? What's the point of continuing the fight? Isn't the goal in boxing to leave with your health and to leave with a legacy? Crawford, Canelo, Usyk, all of them have it. Right? You heard Crawford being slick. And I know they're throwing out big money. Riyadh season, whoa. The sport, I can't recall it having this level of money. I'm sure Crawford is going to be a cash cow for his next fight if he wants it. Folks, you only have to have one off night to lose an unbeaten record. Right? Crawford right now is viewed as a guy who took risks. Right? We'll be years from now thinking, wow, did a 154 guy jump to 168 to fight an undisputed guy? Right? And that question's going to be magnified when, of course, Canelo's going to end up in the Hall of Fame with Crawford. These are going to be Hall of Famers talking about the old days. I don't think the risk reward adds up, personally, for any of the three guys to continue their careers. Right? Now, you and I know, we've been around boxing long enough to know that guys always come back. We've all seen too many comebacks to remember. I remember looking at Larry Holmes. Larry, lost to Michael Spinks twice. At least that's what they tell us. Right? But hell, who am I? I think Canelo won this fight. Larry lost to Michael Spinks twice. I thought, wow, that's a great career. I thought Larry, who was the man for years, understand, Spinks was the only guy to beat him at that point. I thought, well, Larry obviously is going to hang him up, and, what a great career. He was on the verge of beating Marciano's unbeaten record. And then, of course, I saw Larry back in the ring. Right, I'm hearing Floyd Mayweather's coming back in the ring to fight Mike Tyson. Tyson, of course, is back in the ring. Right, all of these guys, Vladimir Klitschko, even guys who haven't been in the ring for years, are thinking about coming back. Right, I understand it's hard to tell a competitor player hang it up. Right, but I gotta say, legacy-wise, Crawford can't top what he's just accomplished. Right? Roy Jones couldn't top what he accomplished by winning the heavyweight title. right? Jones has some idols in the sport. One of them is the great Bob Fitzsimmons. Look him up. Legendary figure, right? Um, and, you know, Roy should have looked at what happened to Bob Fitzsimmons. By the way, Bob Fitzsimmons, you can actually find some of his fights here online. That's the beauty of YouTube, right? Ali, no one remembers Ali's last couple of fights, right? You don't want to remember Larry Holmes against Ali if you're on the Ali side of the ledger, right? That fight ends with Angelo Dundee deciding his fighter. This is the guy who years earlier, Dundee, cut a glove to give Ali time to clear his eyes. Ali against Liston, asked Dundee to cut off his gloves because he felt that, Liston was cheating and had put liniment on his gloves. And Dundee against Liston with his fighter blind. Let that fight continue. Against Larry Holmes, Dundee, asked the ref to stop the fight. Right? Folks, great fighters need to know when to say when. Crawford's on top of the world right now. Unbeaten is perfection. Right? There's no opponent out there on par with Saul Alvarez. You've already beaten Saul Alvarez. If I'm Saul Alvarez, I look at the 11th and 12th rounds. In fact, if I'm Eddie Reynoso, I sit down with my fighter in a private room and I say, player, let's look at this 11th and 12th round. Then after the guy sees it, I say, look, man, I love getting paydays like everyone else, but it's time. Right? Consider stepping away from the sport. You heard the applause Julio Cesar Chavez got at the fight. You're already there, player. Right? Look at your bank account. You're already there in the banking account. Right? If you're worried about money at this late stage of your career, let's talk about Bitcoin. Let's talk about gold and silver. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. Right? You don't need to get hit in the head to have financial security. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.